Hello Year 10, welcome to another lesson on an Inspector course. This will be our 9th lesson, in fact. I'm having to count them down now. So today we're going to summarise what Mrs. Burling did to Eva Smith and analyse how it develops your impression of her character. So we'll read up to the end of Act 2 today and we find out how Mrs. Burling contributed to her suicide. So the word that I'd like you to recall from last week, please, is aristocrat. So what evidence do we have that Mrs. Burling's family might have been aristocrats? So think about that evidence we have right at the start of the play about Mrs. Burling's social status. Okay, so pause the video and answer that question. Then our new word today is elite. Now an elite is a group or class of people who are seen as superior due to their wealth, power and influence over society. Okay, so if you're someone who's elitist, then you hold those views. Okay, that because of your wealth or your power or your influence, that makes you superior to others. Okay, so how has Mrs. Burling been presented as having elitist attitudes so far in the play? So think about our previous impression of Mrs. Burling. How has she come across as someone that holds elitist attitudes? So pause the video and have a go at answering those questions, please. So an aristocrat is someone who is upper class, someone who would have inherited their title from their family or married into an aristocratic family. They are the only two ways of becoming an aristocrat. Another way is to be knighted, but you still wouldn't have the same status as the sorts of families that could trace their family back generations. You were very, very wealthy, typically, and had a lot of power and influence. Now, we are told at the start of the play in the stage directions that Mrs. Burling is her husband's social superior. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean she's an aristocrat, although it could. That Priestley leaves that a little bit vague. It is likely that Mr. Burling was maybe lower middle class originally, and he made his way into the upper middle class simply through his wealth, through, you know, his success in business. So it could well be that he was lower middle class and Mrs. Burling was upper middle class. But it equally could be that she was from an aristocratic family who married Mr. Burling when he was an upper middle class man, simply because her aristocratic family needed more money and Mr. Burling had it. So Priestley leaves that all very, very vague, but it is a really important detail in understanding why Mr. and Mrs. Burling are both obsessed with climbing the social ladder, so somehow sort of breaking into their family, becoming aristocratic. And of course, Mr. Burling's knighthood, although now they're getting into trouble with the police, that is unlikely to happen. But also Sheila's engagement to Gerald, which has of course just broken down in the bit we read yesterday. So Mrs. Burling is presented as an elitist pretty much, you know, from the moment we see her. She tells Mr. Burling off for thanking the cook, as if that sort of behaviour is beneath, you know, someone of her status. Why would you thank the help? She, when she first meets the inspector and she hears about the suicide, she says, oh, who knows why a girl like that would do anything. Girls of that class, as if, well, I couldn't possibly understand what a working class girl would do. So she's presented as someone being very elitist, and you'll see today in the bit that we're going to read, she's presented as even more elitist than before. So we are going to read more of the play today, and we're going to find out what Mrs. Burling did to Eva Smith and how she is involved. Okay? So Gerald has left, going down from here, and Sheila says to the inspector, you know, you never showed him a photograph of her. The inspector says, no, it wasn't necessary, and I thought it better not to. Mrs. Burling says, you have a photograph of this girl? The inspector says, yes, I think you'd better look at it. She says, I don't see any particular reason why I should. He says, probably not, but you'd better look at it. She says, very well. And he produces the photograph and she looks hard at it. So Burling taking the photograph back. You recognise her? No. Why should I? Now it's very unlikely she doesn't recognise the photograph. Instead what we have Because she's being obstructive to the investigation. She's trying to act as if she doesn't recognise the photograph when she clearly does. So the inspector says, of course, she might have changed lately, but I can't believe she could have changed so much. So the inspector knows. Okay, he already knows. Mrs. Burling says, I don't understand you, Inspector. And he says, you mean you don't choose to, Mrs. Burling? Now she doesn't like, neither does Mr. Burling, anyone calling them out on their lies. So she says angrily, I meant what I said. And he says, you're not telling me the truth. So again, he's not afraid to be forceful with her. Mrs. Burling says, I beg your pardon. And Burling says angrily to the inspector, so, you know, he's angry as well. Look here, I'm not going to have this, Inspector. You'll apologise at once. So he feels like he somehow owes them an apology. The inspector says, apologise for what? Doing my duty? Burling says, no, for being so offensive about it. So again, they don't like the way he speaks to them. So they don't like the way he speaks to them like everyone else. Oh, her. He. You know, they don't like the fact that they're so elitist, Mr. and Mrs. Burling. They don't like the fact that the inspector's speaking to them like common criminals. Burling says, I'm a public man. You know, I'm important. I'm an important man in the community. And the inspector says, public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. Now, we're going to put a box around that because that's really important. And remember, one of the key themes of this play is responsibility. He's saying, if you are going to be, you know, when they refer to a public man, you know, you're powerful. He's a powerful man with influence. But actually, it's not just about the privileges that you get as a result of your position. It's about the responsibilities that you then have to the people. So again, we have yet another socialist view. Burling says, possibly, but you weren't asked to come here to talk to me about my responsibilities. Now that's very ironic, because that's exactly what the inspector's here to do. You know, the inspector, they're not telling the inspector anything he doesn't already know. So he is here to talk to them about their responsibilities. He wants them to admit what they've done, accept guilt and change. Sheila says, let's hope not, though I'm beginning to wonder. Now, yet again, Sheila is perceptive. She is picking up on actually what the inspector is here to do. Mrs. Burling says, does that mean anything, Sheila? And Sheila says, it means that we've no excuse now for putting on airs. So, you know, acting as if we're better. And that if we've any sense, we won't try. Father threw this girl out because she'd asked for decent wages. I went and pushed her further out, right into the street, just because I was angry and she was pretty. Gerald set her up as his mistress, then dropped her when it suited him. So that's interesting that she says that. And now you're pretending you don't recognise her from that photograph. I admit I don't know why you should, but I know jolly well you did, in fact, recognise her from the way she looked. And if you're not telling the truth, why should the inspector apologise? And can't you see, both of you, you're making it worse. So it's really interesting. It's almost like Sheila is the inspector's, I don't know, I'm going to use sidekick for lack of a better word. She's supporting the inspector on what the inspector's trying to do here. And that's really interesting because we see how much she's changed. What we also have here is a useful little summary of the sort of story so far as well. So she turns away and they hear the front door slam. Burling says, that was the door again. Burling says, Gerald must have come back. And the inspector says, unless your son, Eric, has just gone out. Burling says, "I'll see." He goes out quickly and the inspector turns to Mrs. Burling. "You're a member, a prominent member," prominent means important, "of the Brumley Women's Charity Organisation, aren't you?" So she's part of a charitable organisation. Now, do you think Mrs. Burling does this because she really, really cares about poor women? No, is the answer to that. She's doing it because it makes her look good. It makes her look actually like she's a kind, decent human being when really she's not. Sheila says, "Go on, Mother, you might as well admit it." "Yes, she is." "Why?" The inspector says calmly, "It's an organisation to which women in distress can appeal for help in various forms. Isn't that so?" And Mrs. Burling says with dignity, "Yes, we've done a great deal of useful work in helping deserving cases." So again, just think of the power it makes her feel. She decides who is deserving of her help and who isn't. And she's only doing that charity to, you know, make herself look good in the community. She doesn't care about the poor. She is, you know, a real hypocrite. The inspector says there was a meeting of the interviewing committee 2 weeks ago. Mrs. Burling says, "I dare say there was." The inspector says, "You know very well there was, Mrs. Burling. You were in the chair, so you were in charge of the meeting." Mrs. Burling says, "And if I was, what business is it of yours?" The inspector says severely, so he's running out of patience a little bit, "Do you want me to tell you in plain words?" Enter Burling looking rather agitated. Burling says, "That must have been Eric." And again, Mrs. Burling's alarmed. "Have you been up to his room?" Burling says, "Yes, and I called out on both landings. It must have been Eric we heard go out then." Mrs. Burling says, "Silly boy." So again, talking down to her child, "Where can he have gone to?" Burling says, "I can't imagine, but he was in one of his excitable queer moods, and even though we don't need him here," the inspector cuts in sharply, again showing his power every time he cuts in, "we do need him here, and if he's not back soon, I shall have to go and find him." Mr. and Mrs. Burling exchange bewildered and rather frightened glances. You know, they, as much as they hate it, they're intimidated by the inspector. Sheila says, "He's probably just gone to cool off. He'll be back soon." The inspector says severely, "I hope so." Mrs. Burling says, "And why should you hope so?" The inspector says, "I'll explain why when you've answered my questions, Mrs. Burling." Burling says, "Is there any reason why my wife should answer questions from you, Inspector?" The inspector says, "Yes, a very good reason. You remember that Mr. Croft told us, quite truthfully I believe, that he hadn't spoken to or seen Eva Smith since last September, but Mrs. Burling spoke to and saw her only 2 weeks ago." So 2 weeks before she killed herself, Mrs. Burling saw her. So that would make it March 1911. So you can write in your timeline, March 1911. So Sheila's astonished. "Mother!" And Burling says, "Is this true?" Mrs. Burling says, "Yes, quite true." The inspector says, "She appealed to your organisation for help." So in your timeline, you can write March 1911. Eva Smith goes to Mrs. Burling's charity for help. So the inspector says, "She appealed to your organisation for help." Mrs. Burling says, "Yes." "Not as Eva Smith?" "No, nor as Daisy Renton." "As what then?" "First she called herself Mrs. Burling." So again, we've got some foreshadowing there. Burling is astounded. "Mrs. Burling?" And Mrs. Burling says, "Yes, I think it was simply a piece of gross impertinence, so rudeness." So Mrs. Burling thinks that Eva Smith used the name Mrs. Burling to mock her or to be rude. Quite deliberate And naturally, it was one of the things that prejudiced me against her case. So Mrs. B had no intention to help her after she used this name. That's what we mean by prejudiced. And Burling says, I should think so. Damned impudence. So again, rudeness. And the inspector says, you admit to being prejudiced against her case? And Mrs. Burling says, yes. Now Sheila's not impressed by this. She says, Mother, she just died a horrible death. Don't forget. And Mrs. Burling says, I'm very sorry. Well, she's not. But I think she had only herself to blame. So again, we have this elitist attitude. The inspector says, was it owing to your influence as the most prominent member of the committee that help was refused the girl? And Mrs. Burling says, possibly. Was it or was it not your influence? Mrs. Burling, stung by his tone, yes it was. I didn't like her manner. She'd impertinently made use of our name, though she pretended afterwards it just happened to be the first she thought of. She had to admit, after I began questioning her, that she had no claim to the name, that she wasn't married, and the story she'd told at first about a husband who'd deserted her was quite false. It didn't take me long to get the truth, or some of the truth, out of her. So at first Eva Smith went there saying her name was Mrs. Burling and saying that she needed money, needed help because she had a husband who deserted her. But eventually Mrs. Burling, through questioning her, worked out that that was a lie. Now, why did Eva Smith lie then? Well, even though it was accepted that, you know, women, unmarried women would be prostitutes and that was okay, obviously there was a reasonably high chance of pregnancy, you know, through prostitution. But if you were unmarried, people would look down at you. So she knew that she would be judged, which is why she said that she was married. The inspector says, why did she want help? And Mrs. Burling says, you know very well why she wanted help. He says, no, I don't know. I know why she needed help, but as I wasn't there, I don't know what she asked from your committee. And Mrs. Burling says, I don't think we need discuss it. And he says, you have no hope of not discussing it, Mrs. Burling. She says, if you think you can bring any pressure to bear upon me, Inspector, you're quite mistaken. Unlike the other three, I did nothing I'm ashamed of or that won't bear investigation. The girl asked for assistance. We were asked to look carefully into the claims made upon us. I wasn't satisfied with the girl's claim. She seemed to me not a good case, and so I used my influence to have it refused. And in spite of what's happened to the girl since, I consider I did my duty. So if I prefer not to discuss it any further, you have no power to make me change my mind. So she accepts no responsibility. And she didn't just refuse to help her, she used her influence, her power in the community to ensure that all the other women in the committee refused to help her as well. The inspector says, yes, I have. She says, no, you haven't, simply because I've done nothing wrong, and you know it. Now, the inspector says very deliberately, I think you did something terribly wrong. And I think that you're going to spend the rest of your life regretting it. I wish you'd been with me tonight in the infirmary. You'd have seen. And Sheila says, no, no, please, not that again. I've imagined it enough already. So more evidence that Sheila is tormented by her guilt and her empathy for this poor girl. She hates the reminder. So the inspector says very deliberately, then the next time you imagine it, just remember that this girl was going to have a child. So Eva, or Daisy, was pregnant. That's why she went for help. She needed money. And Sheila was horrified. No! Oh, horrible, horrible. How could she have wanted to kill herself? So Sheila can't understand how if you were pregnant you could kill yourself. The inspector says because she'd been turned out and turned down too many times, this was the end. Because she had no hope. No hope, no help, no support. Just judgment and nastiness. And so she felt it would be better to kill herself and her unborn child rather than bring that child into a world like the one she lived in. It's going to be blurry. And Burling says, so Sheila says, "Mother, you must have known." The inspector says it was because she was going to have a child that she went for assistance to your mother's committee. And Burling says, "Look here, this wasn't Gerald Croft." And the inspector says, "No, nothing to do with him." So Gerald was not the father of the baby. Sheila says, "Thank goodness for that, though I don't know why I should care now." The inspector says to Mrs. Burling, "And you've nothing further to tell me, eh?" Mrs. Burling says, "I'll tell you what I told her. Go and look for the father of the child. It's his responsibility." So that's who Mrs. Burling blames, whoever got her pregnant. The inspector says that doesn't make it any of the less yours. She came to you for help at a time when no woman could have needed it more. Sorry, I keep looking into this damn camera. And you not only refused it yourself, but saw that others refused it too. She was here alone, friendless, almost penniless, desperate. She needed not only money, but advice, sympathy, friendliness. You had children. You must have known what she was feeling, and you slammed the door in her face. So it's not just the fact that she refused money, it's the way she treated her. And again, this is this socialist view. It's not just about money, it's about kindness, respect, charity, you know, giving someone your time, not just viewing that this person is beneath your attention because of their class. And Sheila says with feeling, "Mother, I think it was cruel and vile." Now this is another really important quote. Firstly, because we have mother as a contrast to mummy from the start, but also cruel and vile. It was cruel and vile, and it shows the level of Sheila and how much she's changed. Now Burling says dubiously, even Burling is, you know, a bit shocked. I must say, Sybil, that when this comes out at the inquest, it isn't going to do us much good. The press might easily take it up. So, you know, he's worried about a scandal, about it coming out in public and about their reputation. He's not shocked that his wife has done something horrible. Mrs. Burling is agitated now. "Oh, stop it, both of you. Please remember before you start accusing me that it wasn't I who had her turned her out of her employment, which probably began it all." She turns to the inspector. "In the circumstances, I think I was justified. The girl had begun by telling us a pack of lies. Afterwards, when I got at the truth, I discovered that she knew who the father was. She was quite certain about that, and so I told her it was her business to make him responsible. If he refused to marry her, and in my opinion he ought to be compelled to, then he must at least support her." So she's going back again to the father. It's his fault. And the inspector says, "And what did she reply to that?" And Mrs. Burling says, "Oh, a lot of silly nonsense." The inspector says, "What was it?" The inspector says, "What was it?" And Mrs. Burling says, "Whatever it was, I know it made me finally lose all patience with her. She was simply giving herself ridiculous airs. She was claiming elaborate fine feelings and scruples that were simply absurd in a girl in her position." Now, a girl in her position means lower class, and elaborate fine feelings and scruples mean morals. So basically, she was showing morals that is simply ridiculous in a lower class girl, as if a lower class girl could ever actually have, you know, be a decent human being. And so it's showing again a real, really elitist attitudes. The inspector says very sternly, "Her position now is that she lies with a burnt out inside on a slab." So as Burling tries to protest, he turns on him. Don't stammer and yammer at me again, man. I'm losing all patience with you people. What did she say? So we can see that from, the inspector's being even harsher than usual. He's really beginning. It's Mrs. Burling, interestingly, that makes him close to losing his temper, because the inspector always keeps his cool. Mrs. Burling, rather cowed, again intimidated, she said that the father was only a youngster, silly and wild and drinking too much. There couldn't be any question of marrying him. It would be wrong for them both. He had given her money, but she didn't want to take any more money from him. The inspector says, why didn't she want to take any more money from him? And Mrs. Burling says, all a lot of nonsense. I didn't believe a word of it. He says, I'm not asking if you believed it. I want to know what she said. Why didn't she want to take any more money from this boy? And Mrs. Burling says, oh, she had some fancy reason, as if a girl of that sort would ever refuse money. So again, a girl of that sort, lower class, is again showing this elitist attitude. Mrs. Burling thinks if you're rich, you're a good person, and if you're poor, you're obviously not. The inspector says sternly, I warn you, you're making it worse for yourself. What reason did she give for not taking any more money? Mrs. Burling says her story was that he'd said something one night when he was drunk that gave her the idea that it wasn't his money. Where had he got it from then? He'd stolen it. So the inspector says, so she'd come to you for assistance because she didn't want to take stolen money. Mrs. Burling says that's the story she finally told after I'd refused to believe her original story, that she was a married woman who'd been deserted by her husband. I didn't see any reason to believe that one story should be any truer than the other. Therefore, you're quite wrong to suppose that I shall regret what I did. So again, still feels no guilt, no remorse. Almost there now, guys. The inspector said, but if her story was true, if this boy had been given her stolen money, then she came to you for help because she wanted to keep this youngster out of any more trouble. Isn't this so? Mrs. Burling says, possibly, but it sounded ridiculous to me. So I was perfectly justified in advising my committee not to allow her claim for assistance. The inspector says, you're not even sorry now when you know what happened to the girl. Mrs. Burling says, I'm sorry she should have come to such a horrible end, but I accept no blame at all. Now, of all the characters so far, Priestley's really focusing on Mrs. Burling repeating this idea of refusing to accept responsibility. The inspector says, well, who is to blame then? Mrs. Burling says, first, the girl herself. And Sheila says bitterly, for letting father and me have her chucked out of her jobs. And Mrs. Burling says, secondly, I blame the young man who was the father of the child she was going to have. If she said he didn't belong to her class, was some drunken young idler, then that's all the more reason why he shouldn't escape. He should be made an example of. If the girl's death is due to anybody, then it's due to him. So Mrs. Burling blames the father of the child again. The inspector says, and if her story is true, that he was stealing money, Mrs. Burling's rather agitated now. Well, there's no point in assuming that. The inspector says, but suppose we do. What then? And she says, then he'd be entirely responsible because the girl wouldn't have come to us and have been refused assistance if it hadn't been for him. The inspector says, so he's the chief culprit anyhow. Mrs. Burling says, certainly, and he ought to be dealt with very severely. Now Sheila says with sudden alarm, Mother, stop, stop. Burling says, be quiet, Sheila. And Sheila says, don't you see? Mrs. Burling says severely, you're behaving like a hysterical child tonight. So yet again, talking down to Sheila, even though Sheila has realised something that maybe you have also pieced the clues together, although Priestley's not exactly subtle. Sheila has realised this thing and her parents have not. Yet another example of the fact that Sheila is less ignorant than her parents. Sheila begins crying quietly, so she's very distressed by what she's worked out. Mrs. Burling says, and if you'd take some steps to find this young man and then make sure he's compelled to confess in public his responsibility, instead of staying here and asking quite unnecessary questions, then you really would be doing your duty. So she's like, go and track down the man who got her pregnant, publicly make him admit his responsibility and let him accept all the blame. The inspector says grimly, don't worry, Mrs. Burling, I shall do my duty. He looks at his watch. Mrs. Burling says triumphantly, I'm glad to hear it. And he says, no hushing up, eh? Make an example of the young man, eh? Public confession of responsibility, And Mrs. Burling says, certainly, I consider it your duty. Now, no doubt you'd like to say good night. He says, not yet. I'm waiting. She says, waiting to do what? He says, to do my duty. Now, Sheila, distressed, now, mother, don't you see? So Mrs. Burling suddenly works out, but surely, I mean, it's ridiculous. She stops and exchanges a frightened glance with her husband. Burling, terrified now. Look, Inspector, you're not trying to tell us that my boy is mixed up in this. The inspector says sternly, well, if he is, then we know what to do, don't we? Mrs. Burling has just told us, let's make Eric entirely responsible. Let's make Eric publicly confess his responsibility. There'll be a massive scandal then, Mr. and Mrs. Burling. Burling is thunderstruck, totally gobsmacked and shocked. My God, but look here. Mrs. Burling, again, agitated. I don't believe it. I won't believe it. And Sheila says, Mother, I begged you and begged you to stop. The inspector holds up a hand. We hear the front door. They wait looking towards the door. Eric enters looking extremely pale and distressed, and he meets their inquiring stares. The curtain closes. End of Act 2. Oh dear. Poor Eric, his mother's just completely stitched him up without realising it. So, 2 tasks then that I would like you to do. Number 1, summarise what Mrs. Burling did to Eva Smith. Write about whether she feels guilt or not and why. Then pick a short quotation and analyse how does it develop your impression of Mrs. Burling's character, and try to link this to Priestley's intentions. And if you want to push yourself further, think about, between her and Mr. Burling, which character do you think comes across as more dislikable? Okay, right, well done. Please take a photo or send your paragraphs to these tasks to your class teacher, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye.